introduce Anna and Tim Harrison. Anna Harrison is a Florida native who was born and raised in Brevard County. She was educated about native plants first by her parents, who encouraged her to identify every leaf and twig, draw the specimens, and learn the botanical names of the flowers, flora and fauna in her own backyard. She went on to study forestry and earned her degree in forest resources and conservation from the University of Florida in 2009. And then Anna met her husband, Tim Harrison, when they were both eco-tour guides, and environmental educators. Tim Harrison has a bachelor's in conservation ecology from Armstrong Atlantic State University in Savannah, Georgia, and has been working as a landscape designer and horticulturist in Georgia and Florida since 2005. Tim and Anna created the Native Butterfly Flower Nursery, which you can see some of outside. Go check out the plants. In 2015, they grow and sell Florida native wildflowers, shrubs, and trees, and their mission is to provide Florida native plants to the retail public and create a home and residential habitats that are environmentally friendly and sustainable. Their joyful design, install, and maintain landscapes to create habitats for the birds, the bees, the butterflies, humans, and all other wildlife. Tim and Anna Harrison will share their joy and gratitude for living our values as people for wildlife and plants. Anna and Tim, come on up.
All right, well, thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting us, and thank you for being here and being interested in nature and the world around us. Sorry, I'm quite croaky this morning for some reason. So I think Beth said a lot of what we are here. Like you said, I grew up right here down the street, like 3 miles away, on a piece of property that I ran around in and played in the bushes and climbed trees and stuff like that. And so I always knew about the plants around me, and it was part of my life. Like, it was just everything I did had something to do with a plant. And I went to school for that, and I always wanted to find a way to encourage people to appreciate plants, and not just the plant either, but the plant's value and what that plant brings and why it's important in the ecosystem. So, you know, we can have a plant, we can have any plant, but if it's not like part of an ecosystem, you know, if we're not part of a group, who are we? What is the plant like? So, and Tim grew up in Atlanta, so he was in a normal housing, you know, normal subdivision, but he was always in the empty lots, always climbing trees, always out in the bushes, doing things like that also. And so, do you want to talk about it, or should I give your own?
Okay, so yeah, I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, and we always out there tended to have woods available for kids to ride three-wheelers out and walk in the woods. There were never no trespassing signs or anything like that. We could just go out and do it, and we never thought of it as anyone's property. And so we watched the birds and animals, you know, that were out there, even around Atlanta. But as it built up, you saw a lot of no trespassing signs go up, and then our old woods got turned into Publix. And after I had gone back after school, and so I went to school in Savannah for ecology and conservation. I was just wanting to study life and reptiles and birds, but ended up getting really into plants. So I took lots of courses in animals and plants and interactions, and you can't have native plants without animals or animals without native plants, because they're all interconnected, and how the planet is interconnected, and they rely on each other. And so then we started doing, well, when I moved down here, I was working in different nurseries because I had studied plants and knew a lot about growing plants. And I worked in a couple of typical nurseries, like palm nurseries, and just places that grew exotic species from all over the world to plant in Florida because of the mild climate here. And I realized how much chemicals are involved and how much fertilizer involved to keep these plants alive. And so I was able to put my education with the nursery experience and kind of create a conservation effort to encourage people to plant native plants that don't need fertilizer. And Florida is so sandy and barren of nutrients. Really only our native plants can survive here without any type of additional nutrients and chemicals and processes like that. So, and then as we grew as a nursery, we realized we've learned so much more about how the native plants are so important for the pollinators and the moths and the birds and all the critters that live around us. And so now we have a nursery. We've been doing this for about 7 years, and we have a retail place in West Melbourne. We grow about 300 species of native wildflowers, trees, and shrubs. And so yeah, we're seeing a lot of change and a lot of inspiration from people who are really encouraged to change their landscapes and cut back on, stop the chemical use.
Yeah, so like Tim was saying, we wanted to do something different, or something that was helping the natural world in general. We both got degrees, and we both kind of thought maybe we would work, for state parks or as restoration land managers, and that didn't work out. I had kids, he had, other things. And so we really feel like we can make a difference because there are so many people coming to Florida. And the truth of the matter is, we can't really stop that. The change is going to happen. But when you come and when you have your space here, that space doesn't have to be separate from the natural world. There's this kind of mentality with landscaping in general. It's a very old, colonial mentality that there's the natural world and then there's my space. And my space is going to be separate from that natural world. But now, our space has expanded far beyond the natural world. Like, there's more of our space than there is natural space. And if we want biodiversity to survive, we have to share our space. That's what it comes down to. And we're talking about birds, butterflies, and bees and insects. Yeah, deers and raccoons and possums are great, and panthers and bobcats and bears are really great, but those aren't the things we're talking about to encourage in your yard unless you have, more than 3-digit acres of property. But if you have less than an acre or an acre, we can focus on the small things, and it makes a huge difference. And this is one of the things that we have seen, and it has blown us away so we've been doing this for 7 years. In our experience, we go into these HOA developments, or any development, where there's flat green monocultures and square boxes of plants. And then we get to our native yard, which is a little bit more free-form. And there is so much life in that yard. So these little creatures can come across. They find their way to these places. It's just like a tiny little rest area for them. And one of the really great things is we'll get to somebody's yard, we'll take our plants out of our truck, and almost instantly there'll be bees and butterflies on them. So they're looking, these little creatures are out there, and they're really looking for what they know. And so that is another really important part of the native plant process and the understanding. You can go down to Lowe's and you can get lots of flowers and lots of colors and lots of shapes and lots of sizes, which is one of the things that we always talk about, is when you plant for the pollinators, you want to plant in colors and shapes and sizes because there's lots of different pollinators. But if you're going down there to Lowe's, these are all plants that have been adapted by humans, for humans, for our viewing pleasure, for our, growing pleasure. So they're easy to grow, and so when we are selecting for a color or a shape or a size or a growing quality, it's a give and take. You're taking and you're selecting for one thing, which is changing the flower, and something else is being lost. And typically what's being lost is the availability of pollen, the availability of nectar, how that plant has grown over the millennia in parallel with some specific pollinator that has adapted to use that specific plant. And this plant only will release its pollen when this bee comes and vibrates at a certain frequency. And so there are so many co-adaptations with the native plants and the native pollinators that when you don't have these native plants, then those native pollinators don't have access. So you will see a bee or a butterfly on these plants that you get from Lowe's, but these are generalists. So we have generalists and there's specialists. And this has, become clear to us over and over again when we put these little plants in our yards. So much life comes so quickly, and then it becomes a totally new experience. So it's not so much the experience of what your eye sees when you walk out into the yard as far as like color and contrast and form and what our visual, what we're experiencing. But it's like what you're seeing the little creatures experiencing becomes so gratifying. I wanted to talk to you about a few of our very inspirational, because we're always learning, we're always listening, we're always learning from other people, we're always reading, because there's lots of different people out there who have experienced these same things, and they're trying to express this to other people. There is a professor in Delaware who is an entomologist, so he has studied insects. And he started studying the relationship between insects and plants. And his name is Douglas Tallamy, Dr. Tallamy. And he's written a couple of books. And this one is a fabulous book called Bringing Nature Home. He started this movement called the Homegrown National Park. He has all of the data, all of the numbers, all of the kind of statistical evidence of things, which is hard for me to just spew out because I don't know them all. But you can read the book. But he has found that there's not enough conservation land. There's not enough land that is protected by the state in conservation to maintain biodiversity. And we're talking about, so he talks a lot about birds, but also insects. But he talks about birds because birds rely on insects. And so there's this, it's this, the food chain, it just goes all the way up. If you don't have native plants, then you don't have native insects, and then the birds have nothing to eat. The relationship between birds and caterpillars is massive. We didn't realize these things. We put out bird feeders. We talk about berries for birds and shrubs that provide berries for birds, and that's very important for the migratory birds. So here in Florida, we have migratory birds that come through here in the winter, and they all need berries. And so lots of native plants have tons of berries in the fall that coincides with migratory season for the birds. But there's also baby birds. So the baby birds can't eat berries. They have to have caterpillars. And where do they get caterpillars? They get them out of our trees and shrubs that are mostly moth caterpillars. And so if we don't have native trees that the moths can lay their eggs on, we don't have caterpillars. And then if we don't have caterpillars, we don't have baby birds. And so it's just, there's so many connections, and they all come together, and they all are rooted and foundationed in your sense of space. Every place on the planet has native plants. The horticulture industry is trying to homogenize this because everything in this temperature range. We went to Australia once, and we're flabbergasted to see the same plants there. It's like, whoa, we could be in West Melbourne right now because there's bougainvilleas and areca palms and slash pines. And it was like, huh. And so it was really interesting. And so it just kind of takes away your sense of space, too. Like, where are you in the world? We all have the same plants. And so Douglas Tallamy has started this program. It's really cool. It's called Homegrown National Park. And so he wants us all to think of our yard as part of this interconnected national park, because we can have birds, butterflies, and bees, and we can support them in our yard in very small spaces. You know, you can have a flower pot on your balcony with native plants in it, and you will see little pollinators on that. It doesn't take a whole lot. Our business is called Native Butterfly Flowers. We chose that name because who doesn't like butterflies? I have met a few people, but most people like butterflies. And so it's a really great kind of way to get people into the process of thinking about, oh, well, they start with butterflies, and then we start thinking about moths. And then if you think about moths, then you're thinking about birds. And then we're thinking about bees, and then we're thinking about other pollinators, because there's not just bees, there's wasps, and there's beetles, and there's spiders, and there's flies, and they're all, you know, part of this process. And then even vegetable gardeners, people who are gardening for food. It's great. You know, you still need to have these native animals around you, because pest insects are part of the ecosystem. So are predatory insects. If you're starting to use chemicals on your pest insects, you're going to kill your right. So here we are. Here's another great book, Beneficial Bugs. It was another one that was super inspiring to us. You know, when you start using chemicals in any form, you're killing your pests and your beneficials. If you can encourage your beneficials into the yard, we're talking about ladybugs, syrphid fly, lacewings, tiny, tiny little insects that most people wouldn't even notice on a normal scale, like a normal day. Minute pirate bugs, tiny, tiny little black specks that you might see on a flower if you look really close. Right, they have this a huge role to play. And we've had many people tell us that once they start incorporating wildflowers into their vegetable gardens, into their food forests, their pest problems go down. You know, it's not going to be eliminated, but it is bringing balance back into our landscapes. So it's been a really, I mean, it's still always a really interesting and fun journey when we start to see creatures coming back into the landscape. And another really interesting thing is watching people change, because people come into our store all the time who are just, they hear about it. They hear that native plants, you know, are beneficial, but yet they're still stuck in these rigid kind of forms of square shrubs or, you know, uniform shapes. And you have to kind of work on them and help them see past just this appearance of the yard. We encourage people to look at their yard not as part of their interior decorating, because so many people, you know, you decorate the inside of your house, and then you go and you decorate the outside of your house with your shrubs and your lawn and your all the stuff. It's like, look at that a little bit differently. We're looking at it as an ecosystem, but yet you can still maintain it. You know, you can maintain your native plants to look, we call it intentional, is a good word that we like to use. Some of us don't mind it looking like an empty lot. Some of us want it to look a little bit more intentional. If you're in a nature way, you know, you add different layers, different, you know, contrasting, sorry, different layers and levels and things like that that help the onlooker see that this is not just somebody who's abandoned their yard and letting it grow like crazy, which some of us don't mind. Okay, you can talk now. My voice is not, sorry to put you on the spot.
Well,
Okay, I can talk again.
I can talk about Doug Talmy. Do we have more time? Okay.
I left my bottle outside.
Oh, yeah. So Doug Talmy, this book is called Nature's Best Hope, and he's got a couple of other books out. He's a researcher, entomologist, studies insects in Delaware, and his grad students have put together a list that Anna was mentioning about our native trees and our native wildflowers and how some are more beneficial than others. And so he has a top list. Oh, cool, thanks. So he had them climbing oak trees and finding the caterpillars that are in the oak trees and identifying what species of moths those are, and butterflies, because oaks are also host to butterflies as well. And he put together a list. So oaks are, in North America, are the highest producing moth caterpillar plant in North America. There's about almost 500 different types of moths that use oak trees. And when a moth lays eggs, they're not like a milkweed caterpillar like monarchs. They lay thousands of eggs, kind of like sea turtles. Sea turtles lay 100 eggs because they know one will make it to survival. Same thing with moths. They lay thousands of eggs on these oak trees because they know most of them are going to be eaten. And it's part of their survival mechanism. And so then some of them hatch out to be moths to continue that, and a lot of them get eaten by predators. And so that's why moths are so high. So some of the top producing native plants in North America are oak trees, willows, cherries, maples. And then as far as flowers, like goldenrod is one of the most important wildflowers, not just for the bees, but for moth caterpillars as well. Different types of asters produce moth caterpillars. So these moths and these plants have adapted for thousands of years, co-evolution together to be able to eat that plant. So the plant doesn't want to be eaten, so it develops chemicals to try to fight the insect that's eating it, and the insect develops ways to eat it better. And so it's a back and forth. It's not like they're, yay, eat me. They don't want to get eaten, but this is how they've evolved. Just like milkweed is a very toxic plant, and that's why the monarch butterfly lays its eggs on milkweed, so that the caterpillars are toxic to birds. So they've adapted these ways with these plants to kind of one-up each other. It's kind of like a chemical warfare. They're attacking each other. But if you take a plant from Asia or South America and plant it in Florida, these moths don't know what to do with that because they haven't evolved with that plant. So if you had a Royal Poinciana in your yard, it's giant and huge, and there's probably very few caterpillars on it. The flowers are too big for our pollinators to get to the nectar or to reach the pollen. It doesn't produce berries in the fall for migratory birds. So a lot of our shrubs, they produce all their berries at the right time of year so that the birds will eat the berries and spread their seeds all over the place to spread the plant. So these plants that produce berries in the fall, they're doing it on purpose so that the birds will eat those berries and poop the seeds out everywhere, just to spread them. And so that's part of Doug Talmy's studies. He's one of the first people. He's been doing this for about 30 years or so. And so it's a great website. If you go to homegrownnationalpark.org, has little videos with Doug Talmy. He's such a great communicator, and we try to take his lessons and use it out in our presentations and when we're talking to people in our nursery. So we grow about almost 300 different species of native plants, wildflowers, trees, and shrubs for people to purchase and plant in their yards.